want to talk briefly about a subject which is not easily to explain or put into words in an interesting way, and that is how we think philosophically about the social sciences, history, anthropology, sociology, and so on. When I went to university at Oxford, there was some teaching, as there had been at my school, about the method of trying to understand the past and the present through various techniques, but it was never very developed or emphasized, and we read a few guides, great books like Mark Bloch's The Craft of the Historian, or the Prolegomena to the Study of History by Collingwood, and we studied how great historians like Macaulay or Gibbon approached their subject, but there wasn't much explicit teaching, and I think that's partly because it is such a difficult thing to try and explain. It seems to be intuitive and a kind of craft which you pick up. So what I'm trying to do is to explain a few methods which I've developed in my own work as a craft of a historian and anthropologist. And I'm going to base it around something which I hope it will make it more interesting, and that is the work of detectives, particularly two of the greatest detectives, Auguste Dupin, who was a detective written about, invented by Edgar Allan Poe in the 19th century in 4 short stories, and Sherlock Holmes, who many of you will know of, and who was the detective invented by Conan Doyle. Now, I've written about this in a couple of small books, and in particular in one called Secrets for Sam, on how to investigate mysteries. And therefore, if you want to pursue any of the things I talk about, have a look at that. I also have talked about many of the issues in another book called How to Discover the World, Reflections for Rosa, which is more about the setting up of problems than the solving of them. So, how to investigate mysteries? Well, the first general point to make is the one that is made by Holmes and others, which is that the method of the historian, social scientist, and also of the biologist, zoologist, and all of the natural sciences is different from that of the physical sciences. In the physical sciences, you start with a hypothesis and move forwards along a chain of reasoning through experiments until you come to a conclusion. This is the method beautifully described and briefly by René Descartes in the early 17th century in his treatise on method, and that is perfectly fine for mathematical and physical sciences. But as Holmes and others have pointed out, it is not the suitable method for the life sciences and for the social sciences. And that's because we start with a problem. We start with the end of the chain. We have an event. We have, as I'll describe, an industrial revolution, a scientific revolution, a capitalist revolution, or we have a species of animal or plant, and we want to know how it evolved and came to be as it is in each case. And this means that we have to move back along a chain from what we have now to the causes. And this, of course, is why it's so similar to the method of the detective, because the detective starts famously with a murder or a crime, and then has to try and find out the stages, the steps which led from the perpetration of that crime, and in particular, who committed the crime. So the detective starts with a puzzle and moves back, just as the historian or biologist does. This reasoning backwards is pretty tricky, and I explain some of the details. But the reason that we need to think like this, and the difficulty of it, is nicely put by Sherlock Holmes. Much of his thoughts on method are contained in a particular story of his called A Study in Scarlet, and this is taken from that. He says, most people, if you describe a train of events to them, will tell you what the result would be. They can put those events together in their minds and argue from them that something will come to pass. There are a few people, however, who, if you told them a result, would be able to evolve from their own inner consciousness what the steps were which led up to that result. This power is what I mean when I talk of reasoning backwards or analytically. This analytical thinking, as opposed to forward reasoning or synthetic thinking, means that you often have to go down many different chains, and of course you usually find a number of different causes. Few things are caused by one original event, but often you can find really significant causes, and in particular you can find necessary causes. Historians and others distinguish between necessary and sufficient. Necessary causes are ones without which something would not have happened. Sufficient causes are those where if that thing A happens, then B must happen. They are a sufficient and complete explanation of a later event. So usually historians and others are looking for necessary causes, and when you get a number or a cluster of necessary causes, you are then likely to have a sufficient causation. So I now want to look at 4 or 5 of the methods which are used by Holmes and Dupin in solving this difficult problem of going along backward chains of reasoning and ending up with some explanation of really major events. Because my own life as a historian and anthropologist has been concerned to try and understand some of the biggest questions, problems of our modern world. What are the origins of individualism? What are the origins of modernity? What are the origins of the Industrial Revolution? What are the origins of the Scientific Revolution? What are the origins of democracy? And those are the questions I will put and illustrate in each case by one of Holmes and Dupin's methods. Thank you.